This is the fourth annual conference on the ideas industry, which is the idea of basically how the 21st century marketplace of foreign policy ideas has evolved. We've had three previous ones. The first one focused on the role of the academy in influencing the marketplace of ideas. The second was on think tanks. And then last year we had a very lively one on presidential campaigns. With this one, we're going to focus on the private sector. And in some ways, it's a nice seamless transition from the previous ones, in that one of the conclusions that we drew from the previous conferences is the degree to which the nonprofit sector has faced genuine challenges in terms of trying to actually influence foreign policy discourse in recent years. In the case of universities and think tanks, they are facing challenges to the idea that they have the monopoly of the reservoir of expertise for a variety of reasons. In some cases, universities are criticized as being far too ideological and left-leaning, particularly over the last 20 years. Think tanks have the problem of being accused of conflicts of interest. There's been a raft of stories over the last few years involving the degree to which think tanks take money from multinational corporations or foreign countries, and the degree to which that ostensibly or allegedly affects their thought outputs of work. In the meantime, on the other hand, this century in the United States has seen the first president who has an MBA, and the last two Republican presidential nominees both have the bulk of their adult experience in the private sector as opposed to the public sector. And in some ways, the private sector has always affected the world of foreign policy, and political scientists have known that. But traditionally, we've thought about the private sector influencing foreign policy more as interest groups rather than as contributing to ideas. And here, the purpose of this conference is really talking about the degree to which the private sector actually creates ideas, inserts them into the conversations, and the way in which they can potentially either trickle up or trickle down into the way countries actually practice their foreign policy. And so we'll be talking about finance and consulting and tech. And indeed, the very term thought leadership, which is a contested term, needless to say, but is nonetheless one that essentially I think the private sector has really pushed into a larger conversation. And it's easy to mock terms like this, particularly if you're in the academy. You get to say thought leadership, and that just promotes a hearty chuckle among those. But I have to say, from my personal experience, I would argue that in many cases the private sector has been further along the learning curve than think tanks or the academy for a variety of areas. I still remember the whole idea of the BRICS as a geopolitical group was born out of a Goldman Sachs marketing term. So you have to give credit to Goldman Sachs there. I still remember in the summer of 2008, I was at a conference in Russia in London, where essentially the great and good in the foreign policy universe had assembled to talk about all the interesting things that would happen when the next president was inaugurated in 2008. And the reason the reason I bring this up is that it was a two-day, conference, and really, you had Latin Americanists, talking about the enthusiasm for what the United States would do once George W. Bush left, or the Pacific Rim, or Africa, or Europe, or what have you, or a variety of security areas. And I was on the last panel, which had to deal with the global economy. Now, this was in June of 2008, and what I remember about that panel was two things. First, by that point, half of the conference had left because it was the last, the last panel. But more importantly, what I remember is that I was the only academic on that panel. It was otherwise three private sector analysts. And I was, without question, the most optimistic of the bunch about the global economy, and I was really pessimistic. The three of them were warning about the Gotterdammerung that was about to come, and a few months later, they were obviously proven right. And there are a whole variety of areas where I do think the private sector, whether it's talking about the role that sovereign wealth funds play in the global economy, or whether or not Chinese power is being exaggerated or not, where I do think the private sector has actually had a more acute sense of what's going on rather than academics or think tank researchers or what have you. At the same time, though, there are certainly questions that are worth asking about the role of the private sector, which is, what is the connection between a firm's thought leadership and their for-profit activity? To what extent is there synergy between the two, but to what extent does the need to make money obviously influence what the more public work is done? How can outsiders, like academics or think tank fellows, trust work of the private sector when a lot of the research that is developed from the private sector is based on what is proprietary information? And then, does the mindset of the consulting world or Silicon Valley lead to biases that are just as problematic as the biases that are discussed very often in the academy or in think tanks? And finally, how best can governments incorporate this kind of stream of for-profit thought leadership? Well, I'm happy to welcome all of you, an array of academics, practitioners, writers, and most importantly, students and colleagues, to be able to listen to the people that I've assembled to tackle these questions. And we're going to start off with a keynote by Professor Jill Lepore. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper Class of 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University. She's also been for a decade a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes about American history, politics, technology, and the law. For most of you in the audience, what she's probably most well known for in terms of The New Yorker was the essay on Clayton Christensen and the idea of disruptive innovation and whether or not that idea really held water over time or not. Her books include The Name of War, which was the winner of the Bancroft Prize in History, and my personal favorite, The Secret History of Wonder Woman, which was the winner of the American History Book Prize. So I believe Jill is going to speak for tops a half hour, and then we'll be happy to take questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jill Lepore.